My castaway this week is a poet, a Catholic Ulsterman. He's been called the best Irish poet since Yeats. Others go further, describing his writing as the finest in the English language today. He's won a clutch of literary prizes and this summer followed the distinguished footsteps of Arnold, Auden and Graves into the position of Oxford Professor of Poetry. He said this is his chance to stir the cultural pot, an indication that this particular poet, liked by his readers and acclaimed by the critics, sees no difficulty in harnessing popularity. He is Seamus Heaney. Seamus, how much did it matter to you being elected to that high office?
Well, it began to matter more to me after the, so to speak, result was declared. Beforehand, I kept it at a distance within myself. I mean, I took it all very playfully. And in fact, many of the remarks I made inside about 3 minutes of hearing the result were faintly sceptical. But I have to say that it's impossible not to respond to the great arch that stretches back and not to respond to the sense of occasion in Oxford itself. It is a fact that a great institution with a great history, the university first of all and then the professorship, does give you a sense of being responsible to something more than yourself. Really.
So what are you now called upon to do? I mean, how do you profess poetry?
Well, the statutory requirement is to give 3 lectures each year, 1 in each term. And I was looking at the original founding statutes, and they are to speak of the old poets in order to polish the endowments of the young, I think, and to help in human and sacred learning.
You also have a wonderful title at Harvard, don't you? You're the Boylstone Professor of Rhetoric and Oratory, which is quite an ugly label, really, for a man who loves words.
It's a magnificent label. I think it's a chair that's kept for people who aren't quite scholars. I mean, in fact, I know that. In Harvard, the standards of traditional literary scholarship are very high. I myself am a BA from Queen's University, Belfast, and haven't trained in research and never did my PhD and so on. So it's kept for mavericks whom they, I think, mightn't disgrace the university.
A maverick who is now the Oxford Professor of Poetry. Tell me how you envisage the desert island that we're sending you to.
I'm afraid my desert island isn't so sunny. My wife and myself have this difficulty always in the summertime. She likes the sun, and if the sun comes out, I retreat into the stone house. So I suppose something Icelandic. And it's fairly bleak with stunted bushes, but wonderful little alpine flowers in the springtime. And the occasional goat, I suppose. And
what sort of figure do you cut on it?
Well, I think I'm gathering sticks and sitting in a corner, rather like people I used to know in the countryside. I mean, I remember one house I used to go into, which was sort of Neolithic house, really. It had an earthen floor and one chimney. It was very primeval. So I think that if I got the hut built and the fire started in the hearth, that I would be completely at home.
So you're not a dramatic hero who's longing to escape. You're more of a romantic who's resigned to life.
Yes, I think I'm in the tradition of the hermit poets of the early Celtic nature tradition, yes.
Right. Let's hear the first piece of music that you'd like to play to yourself.
Well, this isn't very hermity. It's from a Beethoven quartet. I associate this music with a house completely the opposite of the one I've just mentioned. A friend of mine whose house abounds in grace and music, and the spaciousness of mornings listening to music in that place would come back to me.
Part of Beethoven's Quartet No. 13, Opus 130 in B-flat major, played by the Alban Berg Quartet. Were you a born poet, Seamus? Is there such a thing?
Well, most children probably have the solitude and distance and fear of the world which we associate with the truly imaginative being. And the onset of capacity and the onset of capability and the onset of adequacy banishes the poet. So I think that there are many born poets, and that spacious, little fearful part of yourself, that's where the poetical being resides. Probably in that sense I was born, but I would say that many people are born that way.
But reading about your roots, your background now, it sounds very poetic. I don't know whether the reality was such.
Well, the reality was indeed. I mean, when I describe it in words, it immediately becomes, I feel like, a mythic status. It is true that there was a house with trees around it and a thatch, and there were horses in the fields, and people came to the well for water, and so on. So when you're describing that, you're describing a medieval community.
Your father was a farmer?
He was a farmer, but he had a certain freedom. I mean, he had the farming thing, but actually he wasn't enslaved to it. That is the killing thing about small farming, is to be enslaved day and night, day after day. And he had a certain panache with his stick and going out, and he was able to have people at home working on the farm. And
inside the house there were two very important women in your life.
Well, indeed, I've come to realise that I had really two mammies. I had my own mother, of course, who bore me, but my father's sister, Mary, was in situ in the house when my mother came to live there, when she married my father. And I suppose it says a lot about my aunt, the father's sister, that she and my mother worked out. They lived together in harmony. My aunt every day, for example, baked bread. She also milked the cows. She was there to assist. And my mother was much more involved necessarily with the whole business of youngsters. I mean, our family came very quickly, one after the other.
How many?
There were 9 of us. And I think, probably 6 of us born inside 8 years.
Were you the eldest?
I was the eldest, yeah.
Yes. And it was a very happy, obviously very secure household.
It was secure, yeah. There was no menace other than the menaces that are in the imagination, the dark and the trees and the scuttling of wild things on the ceiling at night and so on.
But religion was the mainstay, was it?
Yes, I mean, everything was deeply, deeply full of religion. The social life of the district, first of all, was divided Catholic Protestant, and the Catholic calendar was related to the church feasts, and there was a kind of segregation, The segregation worked at a social level, but the piety and the actual faith worked at a very intimate level of belief. Everything was permeated with it, truly.
Shall we pause there for record number 2? What's that?
Well, this is a namesake of my own. His name is Joe Heaney, Seamus Heaney in Irish. He's singing in Irish. He's singing a famous song called An Bunan Bui, which means the yellow bittern. And he sings in what is called in Irish the Shan Nos, which is the old way, the old traditional singing.
Shinti ta da khrote we won the dome ta nopte skorno adegan norwi sevelin royas nella kalom Gageraskela wimil raching techend awarabla o anini gemnoch asilyak lacherne drachen de velin
Joe Heaney singing An Bunan Bui, a song about the yellow bittern. So were you, Seamus, in the midst of this big happy family, were you a robust child or were you a dreamy chap?
I don't know, I've always thought of myself as a sort of fearful and conformist. I mean, I know I've changed a bit, and that is one of the central gifts and mysteries in my own life, I think, because up until about the age of 17 or 18, I was very, very shy, and I was extremely homesick, for example, when I went to St. Colum's College at the age of 12. I cried easily as a youngster. I had my bottle till I was 4.
The confessions.
A lot of mammary dependence all around.
So what were you like out on the streets? I mean, were you aware as a lad out on your bicycle about the divisions? Were you got at? Were you bullied?
Well, I was very aware of the divisions, but I wasn't got at or bullied. My own household was completely without any sectarian energy. In other words, the attitudes that I heard in the house were never based upon sectarian difference. Nevertheless, what we would call now the sense of difference was deeply there. It was extremely subtle. I mean, it was just a gram of psychological difference in the weighting of the way people behaved with each other. When, shall we say, a Protestant neighbour came to the door to collect milk, just be a faint delicacy of decorum, more decorum observed. And yet that melodramatizes it even.
But the balancing act that you performed, and you've written about it since, haven't you? You've written about 2 buckets were easier to carry than one. I grew up in between, you said. I mean, obviously, I think most people must believe that is the ultimate solution, that people should be able to balance. Do you think it's achievable?
Well, in my experience, it is possible. Certainly at the micro level of a small community, I do believe it is achievable. And I have always been, constantly surprised. I don't want to sound naive. Of course, I know the bitterness inside out. I know it very well. But disappointed, I suppose, that there's not more trust around. I think that's the real problem in the north of Ireland, that the conditions of distrust and the experience of betrayal and the experience of disappointment on each side makes everybody so wary of making any generous gesture that the innate generosity of spirit, which is in many, many people, is hampered, and their public rhetoric becomes more careful than their private yearnings, and I think that's a sorrow, you know.
Let's have record number 3.
Well, record number 3 is from the streets of Belfast, and it's a merry, non-sectarian song sung by my friend David Hammond, who is a man capable of much merry commotion himself.
My Aunt Jane, she took me in, she give me tea out of her wee tin, half a bap and a wee snoot top, 3 black lumps out of her wee shop, half a bap and a wee snoot top, 3 black lumps out of her wee shop. My Aunt Jane, she's awful smart, she bakes wee rings and an apple tart, and when Halloween comes round, for thence that tart I'm always found. And when Halloween comes round, for thence that tart I'm always found. My Aunt Jane has a bell on the door, a white stone step and a clean swept floor, candy apples, hard green pears, conversation lozenges, candy apples, hard green pears, conversation lozenges. My Aunt Jane, she took me in, she give me tea out of her wee tin, half a bap and a wee snoot top, 3 black lumps out of her wee shop, half a bap and a wee snoot top, 3 black lumps out of her wee shop.
David Hammond singing My Aunt Jane, a Belfast street song. You were saying earlier that you became quite homesick when you were sent away to school. Did you feel similarly when you went away to university?
No, I didn't, because I was at home in Belfast and happy to some extent. I mean, a little bit inadequate, but nevertheless feeling confident enough. The boy had got his A-levels and he had got a state exhibition. And
indeed, yes, he was a brilliant scholar. You won a first, so you felt you'd found a bit of yourself, but you still weren't writing, were you?
No.
So what person or what point or what experience was it that unblocked the poetic dam, as it were?
Well, it was after I left Queen's University and I was teaching in Belfast, and I began to read contemporary Irish and British poetry. And I read Patrick Kavanagh's poetry, who's an Irish poet from County Monaghan, who writes very much about the rural outback, the same kind of life that I came from myself. And at the same time, I encountered the poetry of Ted Hughes, which was immensely exciting to me. And it opened a channel into, not just into memory, but into language. I always liked, for example, Gerard Manley Hopkins's poetry. I liked words that had a terrific, rough energy to them. And in Ted Hughes's poetry, this was poetry being written in the 1960s. I said, my goodness, you're permitted to relish this. And you're permitted to write about pigs lying on barrows. I always remember opening the book called Lupercal in the Belfast Public Library, and it said, view of a pig, and it said, the pig lay on a barrow dead. I thought nobody knew about that except myself. So there was that sudden access of, as the Californians would say, permission. And
so the ability to write set in, and it's been there ever since. I mean, do you fear it will disappear?
Well, I think all poets fear it all the time. That is, the life of poetry, as at its most vital, is the life of fear, I think, and panic that it will leave. So that's the great desperate joy each time it comes up and you feel vindicated.
Let's have record number 4.
One of my great joys recently was that to be made a fellow of Magdalen College, a supernumerary non-stipendiary fellow, nevertheless fellow. And,
is that what they called it?
Yes, it is.
Makes you sound like a magistrate.
Yeah. Well, and one of the joys of being at Magdalen is to go to listen to the choir in the chapel. So I thought it'd be lovely to hear the Magdalen choir singing Thomas Tallis, one of his anthems.
An anthem by Thomas Tallis, O Lord, give thy Holy Spirit, sung by the choir of Magdalen College, Oxford, directed by John Harper. You started writing, Seamus, in the early 60s. What were those first poems about?
Well, they really were about a life that I had lived as a youngster. We lived in the same house, the same place, for the first 14 years of my life. And then, in the course of my college life, we moved to another place. And when I began to write in the 20s, it was as if I took the lid of something like an old tobacco tin that used to, those vacuum sealed tobacco tins used to give a little sigh when you opened them, and the fragrance came out. And somehow I went straight back into childhood, really. And the poems are very directly memory-based.
Can you recite one to us?
I'll do one which isn't an early poem, but I have been writing recently, going back to that first place, the first physical place and the first emotional place. This is a poem I wrote after my mother died. It's just a memory of pulling the sheets or folding sheets with her. It's from a sequence of sonnets called Clearances. The cool that came off sheets, just off the line, made me think the damp must still be in them. But when I took my corners of the linen and pulled against her, first straight down the hem and then diagonally, then flapped and shook the fabric like a sail in a crosswind, they made a dried-out, undulating thwack. So we'd stretch and pull and end up hand to hand for a split second as if nothing had happened. For nothing had that had not always happened beforehand, day by day, just touch and go, coming close again by holding back, in moves where I was X and she was O, inscribed in sheets she'd sewn from ripped-out flour sacks.
What did your parents and family think in those early days when you started writing about all those smells and habits and traditions of yours?
My mother and father were given the book. They would read it, but they wouldn't venture any comment. The way it was conducted was through other things happening. Like, for example, if you get reviewed or your pictures in the paper saying, I see so-and-so likes the book and so on. They weren't literary people. They were shy in face of this.
You might have embarrassed them, I suppose.
Of course. It was embarrassing, yeah.
You wrote too, didn't you, about the death of your small brother?
And in an odd way, that wasn't embarrassing, because it was such a solemn and shared memory in itself. And they recognised that poetry is for that.
Your poems were first published, I think, in newspapers in Ireland, weren't they? But then you were championed in the end by London, not Dublin.
I wouldn't want to say that I wasn't championed in Ireland, because very important to me was the Irish Times, the Belfast Telegraph and the Kilkenny magazine. But it is true that Carl Miller published 3 poems in the New Statesman when he was literary editor there. And that was the beginning of a kind of annus mirabilis, really, from 1965-66.
It was a complete turning point, really, that period, wasn't it? Because not only did you have your first book published, but I think you were made a lecturer at your old university, and you got married, and you had your first baby.
That's right. That's quite true.
Well, you were 27 years old. I wonder
right,
which of the
right.
Experiences was the most fulfilling in the end.
They really were intertwined. They really were part of a whoosh of energy. To fall in love, to fall into a book of poems, and all that all at once was blessed.
Another record.
But I would like a speech record, and this voice I love. It's the voice of Jackie McGarren, an actor who died in the early 70s. Samuel Beckett loved Jackie's voice also, and this is from a record Jackie made, and he speaks a piece of Malone Dies, Beckett's novel.
I shall soon be quite dead at last, in spite of all. Perhaps next month. Then it will be the month of April, or of May. For the year is still young. 1,000 little signs tell me so. Perhaps I am wrong. Perhaps I shall survive St. John the Baptist's Day, and even the 14th of July, festival of freedom. Indeed, I would not put it past me to pant on to the Transfiguration, not to speak of the Assumption. But I do not think so. I do not think I am wrong in saying that these rejoicings will take place in my absence this year. I have that feeling. I've had it now for some days, and I credit it.
Jackie McGarren, speaking part of Samuel Beckett's Malone Dies. You've refused, I think, and been criticised for it, Seamus, to champion or be the spokesman of the Republican cause in any way, haven't you?
I haven't been a spokesman for, I think, any cause. And any time I have spoken usually impatiently and out of genuine personal unease and a desire to clear my own slate in order not to deceive either the British or the Irish. And I don't think I have a programme. I have a set of dispositions and affections and a desire as far as possible to conduct myself honestly.
But you believe ultimately in the, to use the non-political word, the wholeness of your country.
Yes, well, I feel entirely free north and south, but I also think it hasn't been worth the whole business, the killing and violence and so on, is leading to no wholeness. In the 60s, I would say my generation of Catholic northern people felt that we were moving just by becoming vocal, by becoming part of the action, by making the unspoken spoken, by making the unprinted printed, that a contribution was being made, that things were moving. At first, I have to say that I think that in the late 60s, early 70s, even when the violence was occurring, it was possible to think aesthetically almost about it, deplorable as that is. And you would say, well, it's terrible, but it means something. It's leading towards something. In the last 15 years, that has been impossible. I don't think it has been leading towards anything. So it is a transformative necessity that we're faced with. And it is only through acts of individual, not forgiveness, but transformation. I think forgiveness is very difficult for people. But if they can change, the energy can be turned into something forward-looking. And I believe that can happen. I mean, these are very vague terms, but I trust the possibilities.
You, of course, in 1972, you left Belfast, didn't you? And you took your family off to a cottage in County Wicklow in the south. And again, you were criticised for that. They said you were turning your back on the north, didn't they?
Well, I guess. I'm not sure. I mean, the fact of that move from Belfast to Wicklow was indeed accidental. We didn't begin the enterprise by saying, now we will leave Ulster. There was a happy chance when a woman wrote to us from Canada, and she said, I have this cottage in Wicklow. I heard on the grapevine you were looking for one. So we went there at Easter 72. And it was a sylvan, romantic, dormer windows, stone, secluded. Yes. So
wonderful. And you've said since that it brought you closer to your family.
Well, indeed, that's true. And I think of that time as a time of listening to radio and behind closed doors, so to speak, stealing a march out on the edge and feeling sort of almost invulnerable because we were so frugal and close to the ground.
Record number 6, I think we need.
Well, this is one of John Field's nocturnes, and I associate this particular music with the cottage in Wicklow very much, and with the wistfulness but security of that time.
John Field's Nocturne number 1 in E-flat major, played by Veronica McSweeney. Seamus Heaney, a poet obviously wants his poetry to be understood, and yours is very understandable, I think. Is that the most important thing to you as a poet?
I think the most important thing to me now, truly, is that the thing be right in itself. It is a matter of form. How do we know something's finished? It's that mysterious tilt of a thing towards being its complete self. To give it its whole itness. Now that's pretentious, it's sounding sometimes, it sounds abstract, but that is really most important.
So you don't mind when people try to read a lot into your poetry?
I don't mind people reading things out of the poems, but there is a difference between reading things into them. If somebody comes with prepared notions and rips evidence for it out of the things, that's one thing. But I think it is entirely possible to dwell upon a poem, to dwell upon a rhythm or a word or a run of words, and to extend and draw out meanings that the poet wasn't entirely conscious of. The analogy I sometimes use is of action replay in television football. If you see a goal being scored first in action, it's very speedy, straight it goes. It's a whole sudden instinctive combination of chance and intention. Then you stop the thing, you go back, you say, play it back, look at that, look at this move. The guys didn't know quite what they were doing when they were doing it, but the commentator and the experts watching the action replay can show you what's happening.
You were talking about the poem as a form. What advantages do you think it has? What power do you think it has that is greater than the play or the novel?
The word poet, I think, within the English language, isn't quite secularized yet. The word novelist is, the word playwright is, but I think the word poet still retains an archaic force. At whatever distance, it's still related to the chant and to the song, and it's related to that space in your throat and your ear where the most common and fond pieties live. You know, I think, for example, of a sound. I use this sometimes when I'm teaching about poetry. That there is a line which runs across Britain and Ireland, and north of it people say "och," and south of it they say "oh dear." And I think you see that somehow poetry taps the ochness of your nature, or the oh dearness. That there is a reservoir somewhere where a certain melody, a certain rhythm, a certain syllable, a certain touch wakens and opens a space into your whole affective, your whole emotional nature. And the most satisfying experiences of poetry are where that inner touch is felt, it's felt instinctively. You don't say, there I have been touched inwardly, thank goodness for that, but something happens. There's an excitement and a pacification at once.
Record number 7.
Well, this is from Schubert's quintet, The Trout. I associate this very much with my rooms in Adams House in Harvard University during the months of February and March. I'm in Harvard on my own. My family are in Dublin, and this record, for some reason, I've played very often in those circumstances.
Schubert's Trout Quintet, played by the Alban Berg Quartet, and the pianist was Elizabeth Leonskaya. Seamus, I haven't asked you, and perhaps I should, who your favourite poet is.
I would have said, a year ago, W.B. Yeats, because I think Yeats's poetry can take the brunt of many things. It can take the brunt of public atrocity. Yeats's moves through a very tragic time in Ireland and writes poems which stand up to the occasion. They aren't just occasional poems about it. They are poems where the man's inner energy takes the measure of the outer circumstances and wins a kind of freedom against it. He's not oppressed. Then I began to react just very recently against Yeats just precisely because of his almost absolute control. And the other poet that I loved in that way too was Dante. I mean, this is in translation, and it sounds, I've said Dante's like the ultimate deterrent when you come to these discussions. He's the atom bomb that you bring out to deter all further discussion. But it is true that Dante and Yeats were of enormous importance to me over the last 10 years or so. Now I find myself more susceptible to delicate lyric poetry. I was in Rome for the first time this April, and we had a very jocund evening, and we went out to view the Forum in moonlight, and I said to my friend, looking at this marble, all this marble temple columns, the hard, perfect classical forms. I said, well, we must stop this. I said, we must get back to Japanese poems about spring shoots, delicate things, little haikus about the cherry blossom. So I'm yearning for some unwritten poetry of sweetness and delicacy.
Let's have your 8th record.
The 8th record would be a sine qua non. I would have to have something, I think, by John McCormick, who, as a child, lying in bed at night listening to radio, one of the radio programs was always listened to was from Athlone, as they called it. It was from Radio Éireann, Irish radio, and it always seemed to have John McCormick singing. This is a song that my wife sings also, a sentimental ballad. Nevertheless, there would be place for that on the island, I hope.
Believe me, if all those endearing young charms which I gaze on so fondly today were to change by tomorrow and fleet in mine arms like fairy gifts fading away, thou wouldst still be adored as this moment thou art. Let thy loveliness fade as it will, and around the dear ruin each wish of my heart would entwine itself verdantly still.
John McCormick singing Believe Me If All Those Endearing Young Charms. You have to choose one of those records, Seamus, which you would require to have with you more than any of the others.
Well, I think because I always feel that I have to improve myself and because I have not made enough space in my life for sitting attending to the large inner spaces of the spirit in music, I think I would have to take the Beethoven Quartet.
I think people might well be able to guess what book you would like to take with you. Would you like to explain which and why?
Well, I would love to take Joyce's Ulysses, because apart from the exquisite joys of the language itself, the way in which the English language is opened like an accordion or a pack of cards in the hands of a magician, the other great thing about Ulysses is it's an absolute documentary soundtrack of the volubility, rascality, and humour and vindictiveness of Dublin.
And your luxury?
Well, I'm thinking of bringing a pair of Doc Marten's boots. My son Michael bought me a pair, and my children enjoy seeing me parading in them. I think they'd be very good for walking over rocks in this faintly northerly island, and also for kicking rocks and trees in moments of exasperation.
Seamus Heaney, thank you very much indeed for letting us hear your Desert Island Discs.